All right. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. I am really excited to speak with Effenus Henderson today. Effenus is president and CEO of HenderWorks, co-founder of the Institute for Sustainable Diversity and Inclusion. He was the chief diversity officer for Weyerhaeuser. He's been all over the world, internationally recognized leader, all kinds of really exciting places: Madrid, Istanbul, Rio de Janeiro, Morocco. He's an author, he's an advisor, won multiple awards, all kinds of things. I could go on and on. I first met Effenus, what was it, maybe 2010, 2011, something like that.
Something like that, yes.
Yeah, so we've known each other a long time. It is really a pleasure and an honor to have you here. So welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so shall we just dive right in, Evanis? As you know, this podcast is all about organizational culture. What works, what doesn't work, how do we make it better? How do we avoid some pitfalls? So you've worked for a long time trying to improve workplace cultures, right? In various capacities. I wonder if we could start with just what have you seen organizations do that really works?
Well, yeah, that's a very a good question. And I think what they've generally done, those that do this well, is to understand that culture is something to be nurtured, to be groomed, that it is something that can change based on the tone, the tenor of leadership, and the way people feel about how they are experiencing the relationships at work. Do they feel like they belong there? Do they feel acknowledged, recognized, and appreciated? And do they feel that their work really contributes to adding value to the organization? And so for me, culture is those things, that represent how you go about that. I'm reminded of the work of Edgar Schein and his work on culture and so forth, artifacts and those visible and invisible things.
Yeah, it's important. And so you mentioned leadership as one of the key ingredients. Like how does leadership impact the culture as far as you see it?
I did a lot of work at Weyerhaeuser a number of years ago before I retired with leadership and specifically relating to inclusion. And we wanted to focus on the concept of inclusive leadership and what are some of the attributes of inclusive leaders. So we did a survey of employees. We just went out and asked, when you think of an inclusive leader, what kinds of things come to mind? And we asked them just to throw out any thoughts that they had about that. And we, a small working group, then took that data and then tried to bundle them into kind of strategic areas. And what we found were four basic things that they exhibited. One was trust, that what you said was your word and it was reflected in your, not only your words, but your actions. And so people not only observed what you say, but they observed what you did in relationships with people other than yourself oftentimes. Another one was around this concept of circles of influence. Oftentimes, the go-to people are people you know or familiar with, and inclusive leaders were those who intentionally reached out to others who aren't, the people that you would normally think of, to invite them in and to expand kind of the circle of influence. And that circle represented people who might be markedly different in terms of their backgrounds, perspectives, and ideas. Third area was this idea of communications, talk about it, share your thoughts about, for example, the culture, what you want to see improved. So people want to hear from leaders in leadership about their views and so forth and their expectations. And so a part of what we found was that inclusive leaders are those that really communicate openly and transparently about what's going on and so forth. And then finally, the idea of providing equitable or equal opportunity for development and growth. And so in this case, the leader in terms of the culture really expected people to not just focus on people who they were familiar with, but people who had potential and could be developed and grow. And so the whole strategy was a broader philosophy around employee development and so forth.
Yeah, that's great. Do you have any I can think of so many examples of things I've seen leaders do that are either really good or really bad in terms of what you're saying. Do any examples come to mind? Any stories about things that you've seen good leaders do that really made an impact?
What I found was that leaders who constantly belittle, berate, particularly if it's in front of the team or others, then generally the team loses respect for that individual. So, what I found inclusive leaders to do oftentimes was to invite people to give them feedback on how they're leading and to say and when they say something or do something they didn't quite understand or might in fact have felt offensive, to be able to say, "Can I talk to you? Can I share some feedback?" So they really invited feedback from others about their experience and how it made them feel. I think inclusive leaders do that quite well. And so I think if you look at the two extremes, I think a leader has to be one who sets expectations, who holds people accountable, who checks in with them, but does it in a way that is in the spirit of learning and growth and development, as opposed to belittling and berating the individual. And so what I found was the leaders who do that generally command the respect of the team, and people are willing to put out significantly more in terms of productivity and so forth in that type of environment.
hmm Yeah, there's such that what you said about inviting feedback can be so powerful when leaders say, like, I know I'm not going to be perfect. I know I'm going to mess up sometimes. I want the feedback. And when you can tell when they really mean it and when they're just saying it because they feel like it's the right thing to do, because you see what they actually do, day in and day out. Do you think it's a change that you've seen in terms of how people are leading?
I think what's different today is that the environment is so complex and things are constantly changing. And so organizations that survive have to have fairly good sensing skills, in terms of what's going on with their employees, what's going on in the market, what's going on in the community, how am I communicating? In today's environment, news travels extremely fast. And if you're too slow in really responding to issues, challenges, either internally or externally, you can find yourself in some level of trouble with your stakeholders and so forth, whether it's employees. They want to know, they want to hear from you. And in this fast cycle environment, the thing that has changed is if you don't communicate, someone will make a story about what they think you're going to say up, and it gets out there, and it's hard to change or shift that perspective. So my view is that leaders today have got to show some level of empathy and compassion for folks, but I think they also have to be laser focused on strategic outcomes. What is it that we're trying to do? How does what you're doing help support that? And let's check in periodically to see how you're doing and what you need and so forth. So this learning orientation in an environment that's fairly complex and constantly changing.
Yeah. And there's this idea out there in terms of what you're saying. There's this idea out there, I think, that thinking about culture, thinking about inclusion is something that takes away from hitting those strategic objectives. It's something that slows us down. It's something that's not as important. Can you talk about that? How thinking about that kind of stuff can actually get you further towards your strategic goals?
Well, first and foremost, what I see happening today is we have too many leaders that have a very short term orientation, in terms of we got to get this stuff done and we got to do it in the next 30, 60, 90 days, without considering how the decisions might impact long-term results in relationships. And so while you might react to something that you see or some pressure that you're getting now without fully vetting and thinking about it carefully, you could in fact put yourself in harm's way with your stakeholders, with customers, with communities, and with others who are playing a more significant role in the business of business. And so you have to be really sure of 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 your mission. You have to be reinforcing your shared values. The things that you say you do. People do not want to see a disconnect between what you're saying and what you profess. In terms of your values and how your business is carried out, because that could be fairly deadly in today's environment, in my view. So I think you have to have a little bit of both. You have to have some, I think Brene Brown would say, empathy, and Simon Sinek would say it as well, in terms of what are the things, that really cause people to want to get up and come to work, that would have customers come and say, I want to buy that product, I want that. Or a community that says, we want that organization in our community. Or even in relationships with local officials and government folks, you want to be able to demonstrate the license to operate in their community in terms of the things that you're doing and how you're serving folks locally and nationally, and internationally for that matter.
You've been doing this for a long time. Like, what was it like doing the work that you're passionate about in the early days? When you first started out, like what were cultures like? What kinds of things did you see, and how has that all changed?
Well, it's been an ongoing process. I
Yeah.
grew up in eastern North Carolina on a farm, on a tobacco farm. And so the idea of working professionally in a firm was very foreign to me during those early years. I had no clue what a personnel officer at that time was, or a human resource
Uh-huh.
officer was, or even, just what was involved in business. And so for me, the early years was like a kid learning something new and exploring and wondering how to navigate that. I didn't know, but I did have some guiding principles, that were very helpful to be honest, to be truthful, to be curious, to ask questions. The early years for me, particularly because we were coming out of a segregated South, it was also how did you show up, how you dress, and how you communicated and so forth. So all of those things were things that you had to test and try to figure out. And so when I first started, there was the facility was in a town that was still very much segregated, and even finding a place to live, wanting to do some of the things like some of the leaders there took for granted, like going to the country club to play golf and so forth. Of course, I didn't know anything about golf, so it was not a big draw at that point, right?
Yeah.
It was something I had to learn later on as well. So I think the thing for me was also anticipating constructive feedback versus bias, and trying to discern that, because I was very unsure of whether when they're giving this back to me, is it because of who they see me to be, or is it
Mhm.
actually constructive feedback? So I had to grapple with that and learn and to trust my instincts a lot more. And so
Yeah.
and so what happened was I didn't have that grounding in a professional setting. And so I had to learn the first few years in terms of what was going to be helpful to me, and how I could help support the organization, and how I could share information in a way that people would listen, would understand it, and believe it. And to me, that was
Yeah.
part of the early transition work for me, was transitioning from just a everyday farm boy, on a tobacco farm in North Carolina, to moving into a professional career after college. College helped shape and prepare me a little bit for it, but it really never prepares you because there's um, no cookie cutter approach to culture in an organization and where that organization may be at. And so
Yeah.
to me, the early things were to listen, to work hard, and to provide input and suggestions and not feel shy. The first thing that I had to overcome was this notion of, well, if I'm on a working team, I expected the leader to be the one to make the final decision. And if I had an idea, if he wanted my idea, he'd ask me for it. And what I had to
Hmm.
learn was you have to be a little bit more assertive and aggressive and just speaking up and saying, "Hey, I've got an idea," and so forth, and let me share it with you, and not take the response negatively. In some cases, you might have a real poor leader who might say, "Well, that's a bad idea. Let- let's move
Yeah.
on," or something.
Yeah.
So it's in the way that the relationship is created with that supervisor or that leader. And so those were some of the
Yeah.
learnings that I had to address early in my career.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Now, what year are we talking here,
Uh,
roughly? You don't have to out your age if you don't want.
it was
You-
in 1973 in eastern North
okay.
Carolina in a community that didn't even have a McDonald's or a Burger King, right? It was just a very small manufacturing town where I worked at Weyerhaeuser was the only game in town, and it was a very good company. And so you either worked there or you did something else that wasn't as productive and as financially beneficial and so forth.
Wow. And what made you, I mean, having grown up on a farm, what made you want to go into the corporate world?
The farm. No,
you you didn't feel didn't want to milk
shit.
cows at 5 in the morning
There you go.
anymore.
All of that, as they see in North Carolina, cropped it back, and during that era, things were still not as highly mechanized as they are today. So farming has become much more mechanized and automated and so forth in terms of production and harvesting and so forth. And so I knew that I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to pursue. In fact, I didn't even know I wanted to work in private industry. I went to work right out of college in a nonprofit organization as an assistant for research and planning. And there's a story even behind that. When I saw the ad, I said, "See, I think I could do that." And so I went and applied for and talked to the executive director, and he says, "I don't know if you've got the skills to do this. So, thanks, but no thanks." And so that was the first day. The second day, a day later, I said, "Well, then I'm going to go back again. I'm going
Ah,
to
good.
pester this guy." And so by the end of the week, he said, "Okay, I'm gonna give you a try," and so forth. But it's also the idea of not necessarily undervaluing yourself in terms of your marketability, and to be able to speak up and speak out about how you might be able to support the mission of the organization and so forth.
Hmm. And what how did you get passionate about, what you ended up doing with culture and inclusion? Like where was it those early experiences or what drove you there?
Well, I would be how do I say this? In college, I would be kind of one of those activists who was out protesting for civil rights and social justice and change. And so my passion for human resources work really grew out of and diversity and affirmative action and all of that. Actually grew out of that grounding in college where, as I looked at how people like me were being represented in organizations, they were oftentimes not represented. And the challenge then was how can I help create a process that would allow more people that are underserved, underrepresented into the workplace. And at that time, Weyerhaeuser was actually trying to do more of that. And so what was exciting for me when I first started was as a personnel representative, I did a lot of interviewing. I said, "Oh, this is kind of cool. I could sit in here and talk to people and interview them and make recommendations about them for employment." But then it started to it started to expand in terms of how do we create a more inclusive and diverse organization. And so I said, well, you're only going to these schools. Why don't you consider going to these other schools where there's a higher number of people who look like me that could be potential candidates? And so part of it was helping to rethink and reshape a kind of the approach and the outreach to those communities. And because if you don't go there, you're not obviously going to have them in your pool. And if you don't have them in your pool, what's going to happen? You're going to get the same old thing that you always got. And so that speaks to all dimensions of business in terms of perspectives, ideas, approaches, exploration. In fact, in terms of other potential ways to improve outcomes. And what's helpful to me is really appreciating the business imperative, the economic drivers that, and what was gratifying, when I would read reports from McKinsey and, other consulting firms like Accenture and Deloitte and the work that they were doing, they began to emphasize how having more diverse, inclusive approaches to carrying out their business was in fact good for business, that you're not doing this just because of compliance and regulation, that you're getting brilliant ideas and you're able to penetrate markets that perhaps you never penetrated before. So there is an economic value to be had as well. So for me, it was getting excited about helping people think about new ways to solve that challenge.
I keep getting stuck on things you said about the segregation in the town and what you experienced going into the corporate world. Could you say more about that? Because 1973, that's a long time after people think segregation ended, right?
Yeah, well, here's an experience that I had during my early years at that location in Weyerhaeuser. The town was segregated. In fact, the country club where people played golf and in fact also would go to eat lunch uh, was we perceived it to be segregated and so forth. And so as I would I recruited a chemical engineer, African American chemical engineer, and we became good friends. And he said, gee, if you're going to start attracting more people like us to this community, we've got to break down some barriers and so forth, not just at work, but within the community. And so he and I decided that one of the things we wanted to test out, and I was a little bit nervous about doing this, but he said, take, for example, the country club. It's the only nice place to go eat lunch in the town, but it appears that we can't go there, or at least we think we can't go there. And so he said, "Okay, let's do this. Let's just show up one day at there and
Uh-huh.
see if we could be served at this country club." And so we went out, and we actually did get seated, and we actually were served. So it was that fear that had taken over, and in that, we can't do that. We're not allowed there. And I said those are some of the types of barriers that we experience.
I'm thinking about the invisible barriers that you were talking about with the country club. And there's so many invisible barriers in workplaces that people don't even realize are there, right? Like leaders saying, yeah, I've got an open door policy. Anyone can come talk to me. But not everyone feels the same level of comfort to actually do that, right?
Right.
Some people see those invisible barriers there. Um, Talk to me about that. What are invisible barriers that you found in workplaces that get in the way?
Well, I think there are a couple of things, closeness, where you work, who you're relating with, and how work is carried out. Because sometimes you get so caught up. One of the invisible barriers is getting caught up in your work, in not taking time to advocate, to build relationships, to collaborate. One of the things that, as I looked at people who advanced within the organization, they basically had, there was the 3E concept that one senior female leader, VP, one of our highest ranking females at Weyerhaeuser at the time, said the 3 E's. Remember the 3 E's: experience, figure out where you need to get the experience to be competitive. 2, education, make sure you have the educational grounding for the work you do. And 3, exposure. That it's not
Mm.
enough. I mean, you could be in your office or cubbyhole is what I was, because during that time we were an open landscape type of organization where there were no private offices. But that exposure is key because you want to get yourself in front of people who can make decisions about your career or maybe consider sponsoring you in terms of your own personal development and growth and so forth. And so for me, some of those hidden barriers were the cubby holes, the pit, the places that we work and not feeling comfortable venturing out, asking questions or building
Uh,
relationships. Um, I think some of it was that even some of the biases around qualifications for roles in a fairly large company with a variety of divisions. Working in one division, people might say, well, you can't work in my division. You only have experience in that other division. And as you move up the organization, the technical skills around how you do work becomes less important than the leadership skills or the general management skills, and you can acquire those across a variety of business lines. And so, one of the things that we saw early on was this model of promote from within and promote from within your business sector, and not try to compete for jobs in another division. Well, we kind of busted that paradigm at Weyerhaeuser when we started what we call cross business development. So we'd identify people who were emerging leaders through our succession planning process and say, could they lead a facility or operation in this business given their background and skills? And we tended to do more of that. And a reason for that oftentimes is that women and people of color were heavily concentrated in staff roles, staff support roles, human resources, communications, accounting, and they had as good a skills as those that started out in a production-oriented environment or manufacturing environment. And so it was figuring out how to create more cross-collaboration and so forth, and getting leadership to accept that. That was part of it, getting the leadership to accept that you don't necessarily need a person to come, grow up just in that product line or in that business. There is some value in having that cross-fertilization because of perspectives and ideas and so forth. So we did more of that. So I think in terms of invisible barriers, that was one of those. Another invisible
yeah.
value, in some respects, is geographic. You know, it was a fairly significant decision for me to move from North Carolina to Seattle,
Mm.
Washington, because all of my family was in North Carolina. And I came from a large family, as did my wife. And so to uproot and to disrupt ourselves from the family was a big decision. And so it was adjusting to new norms and new behaviors and new observations that we didn't see back south. So I think those are, and being willing to be curious about that as opposed to back away or retreat from it. Those were just some things as well.
Yeah. We often talk on this podcast about the different kinds of culture, the different cultures we belong to. And certainly moving from North Carolina to Seattle must have been a big culture shift in that respect.
Yeah, there's another dimension of it is particularly around people of color and especially African Americans. When I first started, in business, the culture was extremely formal. You had to show up at work with a shirt and tie. You could have a sports coat on, but you generally had to have a shirt and tie on. If you were the men, and women had to be dressed. There was no pants and so forth during that era. And so that was a fairly interesting shift. And as times changed and protocols shifted, what I found was that in many respects, some people still love to dress up, and I was one of those. Right? Oh, you're looking pretty
Mhm.
sharp to be here at work today. I mean, but it was kind of you were trying to play the part or to look the part in terms of how you dressed and so forth, and the more casual I felt I looked, the less serious they may have thought that I was about the job and the role and so forth. So it was this kind of constant adaptation to this growing informality of business environments and so forth. Because early in my career, it was quite formal. If you, it was this was interesting. If you uh, wore a shirt and tie and you took off your jacket in your office, if you had to go to a meeting at a reading room, you pick up the jacket, put it on, and go to the meeting in that conference room. So it was quite an
Mhm.
interesting time. It's quite different, obviously today, but it was sort of part of that evolution of the culture and those things that made sense and so forth.
Yeah. Do you think that bias played a role in that? I mean, you hear like who feels comfortable to dress casual and who doesn't. It feels like maybe there's some biases that come into play too.
I think
What do you think
oh,
about that?
absolutely. I think there are some biases, and it's that perception of who you are, and this notion, particularly in the Black community, you got to be twice as good to get half as far. And part of that was also based on how you dress, and in some cultures outside of work, when you went to places to worship, to church, or if you're going, even if you went out to the club back in the 70s and 80s, men tended to dress up much more and look the part. And I attribute that to the fact that many of us were in farming communities and worked in blue jeans and, and all of that. So we wanted a place where we could go and look good. And so that, I think, in many respects, culturally, uh, uh, also extended to the workplace. And so looking good, dressed up, hair comb, all of this stuff. it was
Mhm.
it was part of the conditioning at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet some listeners haven't heard that before. What you were saying about this idea that in the Black community you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. Can you say more about that? Like, how does that get passed along, those ideas? Like, I bet people just aren't familiar with that.
Yeah, that's one form of that is what's called the talk, in terms of when you go out in the community at night or something like that, you get stopped by a policeman. There's a certain behavior you have to exhibit because of the fear of being dealt with negatively, or even shot or killed and so forth. So there's this whole grooming, this talk about how in multicultural relationships you have to act and behave, and that extended in many respects to the workplace. In many of the universities, particularly HBCUs, there were programs, there were organizations that helped you learn how to dress, learn how to talk, learn how to behave in a situation, and it was particularly part of the grooming process in the African American community. In
Mhm.
fact, and it's gotten a lot more relaxed, but in many families, you were observed by your parents when you're going out, and if you weren't dressed correctly or appropriately, they would bring you back in and say, "You need to go go iron that shirt." I mean, when our kids were really young and we moved to Seattle, one of the things that Helen would do would be to press their jeans, and they'd have little creases in the jeans and so forth. And because part of it was looking good, because if you look good, people have higher expectations of you. One day the kids came in and said, "Mom, stop ironing our jeans. The kids out here don't wear pressing." And I'm getting teased about the fact I've got such creased jeans I
Mhm.
mean, so it was all those little things, those adjustments to the cultural differences and so forth. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, gosh. I mean, when I think there's a lot of misunderstanding when people hear the word privilege, like white privilege, for example, but they people think that means, oh, everything, your whole life was easy and you got everything handed to you, when in fact it's things like just not having to think about what you're talking about, right? Like not having to think about those things that you even had like courses on, right? Dressing and stuff like that.
Well, and it was even real early on in the '60s and so forth. Before that, growing up as a kid in the South, there were places you could go and places you couldn't go, and places. I mean, I was remembering the Greensboro Four, the four African American kids out of North Carolina A&T who decided to help integrate a lunch counter at Woolworths at the time. And that was part of the whole movement for civil rights and so forth. And so a lot of things that people don't appreciate, and some of those cultural dynamics haven't all gone away, in terms of the fear, in terms of the bias. My family was the first to integrate a school in North Carolina, and with that, we were bombarded with phone calls and threats about if we weren't taken out of those schools, they were coming to burn a cross in our yard and so forth. So,
Mm,
so
mm.
and well, my father was a military veteran, and we had lots of guns, and so he said, "Bring it on. We'll be here to meet you." I mean, it was
Wow.
that kind
Wow.
of dynamic at play, and to not let fear rule, your decisions and your opportunities and so forth.
Wow. That's intense and feels very brave also. Gosh. Yeah. So I mean, tell me more about that. That's a big deal, being the first family to integrate this school. Like what else happened with
Well,
that?
there were challenges and calls, and there was disparaging remarks and made. I was the last to attend, historically African American high school. My brother next to me was the first, mainly because it was a brand new high school that had just been built. But I had already built relationships and friends at the school, so I said I might as well finish out my high school career there. He went to the school, and it was challenging because issues around how you talk. I'll give you an illustration of that. When one of my kids was in middle school here in Seattle in Federal Way, he had been given an assignment to work with his parents on an essay or some report, as well I can remember. It's been a number of years ago, and so we worked with him in terms of his writing style and the materials he needed to have as a part of that report, and he submitted it in, and then a couple of days later, we got a call from the teacher that said, "There's something wrong with your son's report." And we said, "What?" "Yeah, it's too good."
Mm,
It's just too good. And so I was at work, so I talked to my wife, and we said, what do they mean it's too good? So we need it because, the instructions were work with your parents, lay it out, write it yourself, which is what he did, but it was deemed too good. And so we had to have a conversation with the teacher and the principal about that type of
hmm
behavior because it was very disrespectful, and it assumed that, he did not have the intellectual capability to do level at that work. And if you think about that with
mm.
other kids in the school, particularly kids of color, it would it would be demoralizing, and they would lose faith and hope, and in some cases be relegated to a special education class or something like that. So it was important for us to confront that head on.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. And feel that feeling inclusion. I mean, we talk a lot about feeling inclusion in a workplace, but feeling inclusion in a school is so important too. One of the main factors for how much you can learn is just how much inclusion do you feel in that school? How much do you feel part of a network of care rather than experiencing all those biases? So that
Absolutely.
makes a difference. Yeah. Switching gears. Thank you for sharing all of that. That what must feel, I don't know, does it feel painful to recall those memories, or what does it feel like to you
Well,
now?
it feels like I've matured into understanding how to navigate more effectively and to help coach and guide my children and grandchildren and so forth. And it was painful at the time, but it was a growth opportunity for me, and it expanded the way I think about things and the way I've worked since my retirement and my founding of my company and my work with the Institute for Sustainable Diversity and Inclusion, because it's an ongoing process. I'm writing a short report on what I call I'll say it 15. At the title of the report is 15. So let me see if you can guess what 15 is all about.
Hmm. I love the title. I love the mystery. I can't even guess.
Okay, 2040 is 15 years from now. And
Oh, okay.
2040 is the time when it's predicted that the U.S. will become a majority minority society and democracy. And so 15 is as we start to move towards that, and in some cases, the population under 18 is already there. So the question, it becomes one of adjustments and adaptations and inclusion. And how do you think now differently about a society that, there's no one demographic that uh, has the superpower that it may have had in the past? And what are the challenges that might present for those who might want to resist that kind of society, and what are the opportunities for building a more inclusive society? So 15 is just my way of talking about and saying, here's what's likely to happen, and how do you think about that from an organizational standpoint, from a business standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, from a relationships and coalition building standpoint. So it's
Yeah.
just
I want to
go ahead.
I want to hear more. I want to hear more about it. Like, what if you could imagine, knowing all that you know about workplaces and with all your experience, what do you imagine is going to be different in workplaces in 15 years?
Well, there's two concepts that I think that will be different. The current view is that because of this exploding demographic change, that the workplace will look and feel and the expectations will be different. That's true. But for some people, it feels like jobs that they traditionally had the power and influence over, they won't have, because there's a mixture of people that are going to be competing for those roles. So replacement, in terms of what used to be, will no longer be. It's just kind of how we're evolving to this new reality. The other part of it is what I call displacement, and displacement really is the really rapid change being created by technology, artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, all of those things
Yeah.
are actually changing the way organizations think about work and how work is performed inside and outside of organizations. In fact, if you look today, I'd say of all workers, probably 30 to 40% of them are freelancers, people who work on their own that are not tied day to day to a particular business. You'll likely see more of that. The other thing that I think, because of technology, the world becomes smaller in terms of relationships and understanding. And so by 2040, someone in Ethiopia, for example, will have the technology and the understanding and the access to information and data that when I was growing up, you didn't have access beyond your rotary phone, right? And the people you could
Yeah.
call. So if you think about the
Yeah.
reality of this fascinating transformation in terms of work and production and things like that, it's going to create a different dynamic in the way people work and where they work. I call it deployed versus non-deployed talent. Deployed talent are those freelancers and so forth that make up a bigger proportion of the work. You think of it today in a lot of the consulting firms, when they have a lot of their work outsourced to India or South America or Asia. I mean, you're probably going to see more of that as an efficiency and a cost dynamic at play. So those are things I think leaders and organizations need to be considering and thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a disruptive time. I mean, AI itself is so disruptive in so many ways. I wanted to ask too, you've done so much work on inclusion standards, and I wanted to ask like how you see standards being important for culture, for inclusion at an organization.
The thing that I think the standards do that some earlier work in DEI did not do was to start to think about this as part of a social system. I call it a system, an ecosystem. And I talk about the concept, and this is kind of the book I'm working on now. It's called Diversity is Not the Defect, Exclusion Is. And what I mean by that is that if you think about your human system in an organization, um, if an aspect of how you manage that system is missing, whether it's diversity of thought, perspective, background, whatever, then you suboptimize the system. And particularly as we start to move towards 2040, 15, uh, you you have people who have greater expectations. The other thing that is different that 20 years ago, 10 years ago, people did not have to contend with is the cry of the stakeholder. And so, I mean, you see that in the issue with Target and how they decided to back away from their commitment to an inclusive approach to their business and back away from the DEI programs, and how it impacted their results, their ROI, and their reputation, and the fact that they lost a fairly substantial slice of business from a predictable community that was not happy with that decision, as opposed to say a Costco, which is here in our area, their headquarters, who've basically integrated this work into the social fabric of who they are as a business, and it becomes sort of just a part of who they are. So the standards really start to help you kind of tease out and think of this work not as a human resource imperative, but one that is one that's a stakeholder imperative. That in order to truly optimize your value with your customers, with your communities, even with employees, and if you look simply at the cost of turnover and retention, and you tease that out by demographic sectors, and you find that a particular demographic is turning over twice the rate of everyone else. It helps you then pinpoint the challenges or opportunities that you have within the business. So the real key is to see the work as an integral part of the social system within and the fabric of the organization, not as an initiative or compliance driven activity. And so if you look at marketing, for example, what's the inclusion lens that should be applied? If you look at even accounting, what's the inclusion lens that should be applied? If you look at growth in terms of expansion activities, what's the inclusion or diversity implications of that growth? If you look at human capital and who you have, what's the inclusion or diversity dimension of that? I mean, the folks with the loudest voices today are shouting quotas and reverse discrimination. It's really not about that. It's creating organizations and cultures that are adapting to, responding to, and building the capability to serve a much more diverse and inclusive society than we've seen in the past. And you can't do that by continuing to do the things that you've always done and the way you've always done them. It's not going to work.
I love that. That feels like a good place to wrap because that's inspirational. Where can people find out more about you and your writing?
I'd invite anyone who'd like to find out. I do a lot of posts on LinkedIn, and I actually accompany some of my writings with music, lyrics, which I create that are tied to the article that I'm writing. the theory that I have there, just to as I'm closing this out, is to say that we have to think differently about how we communicate and share information. And as you look at the generation that's now being trained on clickbait, click bites, and so forth, you've got to share data in a way that they can understand and creates a curiosity to want to learn more. And so I find that sometimes my music will appeal to someone who may not want to spend the time in reading an essay or an article. So
Yeah. Oh, that's
so
really cool.
LinkedIn is the place, and I'm actually on Substack now, so you can actually participate in some of what I write there. And my website is www.henderworks.com. With ISD, the Institute for Sustainable Diversity and Inclusion, is www.i4sdi.org. That's another, or you can send me a note at my email, effenus.henderson@henderworks.com.
Excellent. Thank you. And one final question. I sometimes like to give listeners an optional sort of homework assignment. If they wanted to try out something new, you're talking about organizations trying something new, but sometimes it's really helpful for people to try something new too. If people wanted to try something new or read something or watch something that you would recommend, what assignment would you give them?
Gee, that's interesting. I don't want to be self-serving, but I've just published earlier this year a book that reflects a lot of my thinking. It's called Spine, and Spine is an acronym for the word strategy, practice, ideation, need, and execution. So if you're interested in something like that, it's on Amazon. Or if you're interested in my 15, it's more of a piece of writing. Send me a note. I may decide to share it with
All right, there
All
you
right.
go. A little challenge. You may get it from him if you email. Evanus, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I know our listeners appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all soon. Thank you,
Thank you.
Evanus.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye bye.